Welcome to episode 1 of the Mindshift podcast. I'm going to explain it here briefly and then we'll get straight to today's guest. The podcast is a new endeavor that I'm very excited about, where it will be discussions. I want to talk to people from all different backgrounds, from all different walks of life about all things worth thinking about. This podcast will hopefully branch out into many different directions. However, guest 1 today is going to be a familiar space. My first guest is Apostate Aladdin, who is an ex-Muslim that is doing counter-apologetic works on his channel. I am a big fan of this creator after watching some of his videos. I love his philosophy and the approach that he takes with his channel and his mission. Today, I invited him on to talk a little bit about being an atheist advocate, or if he is and what that looks like. We have a wonderful discussion around the differences between Islam and Christianity and how that looks as both a believer and as someone who is deconverted from one of those faiths. We cover a wide variety, quite the landscape of topics, and I hope that you will enjoy. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Apostate Aladdin.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me as your first guest.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. I found you via Drew's shout out from Genetically Modified Skeptic, which is a pretty cool person to get a shout out from. How did you feel about that?
Oh, I was really excited. I've collaborated with Drew a couple of times and hopefully more again in the future. But it's kind of unreal to me because I used to watch his channel before I even started mine. So it's just such a small world.
It is funny to start, for me, I was a Christian when I started watching these videos. And there are now people that I've collabed with or that I have at least had real conversations with that were pivotal in me leaving the religion. And now to be working with them or in the same space as them is something pretty cool. I'll have to check out what you and Drew did. But I want to kind of set the stage for us today. I have a goal with the new podcast side of the series, which is just things we should be thinking about, things we should consider if we need to rethink or have a mind shift on. And so the question that I want to ask you for today's topic is going to be based around your deconversion and the differences between being an apostate with Islam versus Christianity and your channel. So why should we be thinking about this kind of stuff?
Well, I can think of a few reasons. The first being that it's important to think about epistemology, about how we know what we know, and whether we're doing that in this context or another one, that skill you can carry with you to other parts of life. So that's something that I try to emphasize. I used to have a lot of discussions on live streams asking believers, what do you believe and why do you believe it? So the focus of my work is not necessarily to spread atheism or defend the idea of atheism. I'm even kind of agnostic about it because I don't know if we can ever know for sure. But I'm also not okay with that being such a valid possibility that I have to treat that hypothesis as if it's almost true. So I'd like to advocate for people who are in positions like mine to be recognized and respected for their position, because the representation that we have right now is very unfavorable and unfair. And I also want to contribute to this kind of space where there has to be discussion between religious and irreligious people because we exist in the same world and neither side is going to disappear anytime soon. So it's good to contribute to that space in a way that's not necessarily too inflammatory or reactionary and actually focus on the ideas rather than the people or the feelings in some cases. That's most of why I think it's important to focus on this stuff.
Yeah, I love that distinction. It's interesting because I get the question, well, Brandon, you're attacking Christianity so hard. Like, what do you want? You just don't want there to be Christians. And that's not necessarily my goal either. I want to limit the harm that comes from what I think are false religions. I mean, I would never want to get in the way of someone's belief. I believe in, freedom to believe whatever you want, as long as you're not infringing and hurting others. It just so happens that with some of these big, I think, especially Abrahamic religions, they do carry such inherent baggage or harm that my stance, I would never say I'm like a militant hardline atheist or anything like that. But I have felt my stance shift a little bit more from just, I want to talk about the truth and find the truth to, well, I'm so sure that this thing isn't the truth and the harm that's with it, that I do find myself being a little more aggressive in that takedown than I had originally thought. What are your thoughts between those lines, or how do you measure it for yourself between your stated goal of I want to help people live in a world where there's religious and irreligious people, with what I'm assuming you would say is the falsehood or even the harm of Islam? How do you fit between those?
It's very tricky because you mentioned something about this that, the harm is what we focus on, but sometimes the harm is self-inflicted. It's what your mind does with the information that you have. So it's not just about preventing the spread of harm from religious people to others around them, but to themselves as well. And you can't convince someone that they're harming themselves. You can't really force them to leave their belief or amend it. So through conversation, through having them listen to other people who realize that that same belief is harmful, maybe that'll open their minds up a little bit. Now, I don't know exactly what that looks like on the believer's side, whether that means that they amend their belief enough to the point that it's not harmful, or if they abandon it altogether. That's not my call to make, it's theirs. I just want to make sure that they understand that others have made those calls and they've made it out okay, because we hear a lot of horror stories about how otherworldly these ideas are, and how they're tempting and taking you to the dark path. So it's important to show those people that normal everyday people leave religion, or adopt some kind of progressive version of that religion, and they're doing just fine.
And I'm talking out with you my own internal battle, because I think that you're in a similar place enough, and it sounds like you've done the thinking on it, that I'm not even trying to play devil's advocate. I'm telling you what goes off in my own head when I kind of have these conversations with myself. I understand and agree that so much of the harm done from religion is put on by the self. These are the chains that we've chosen to shackle ourselves with. And in thinking certain things, or being afraid that someone knows what we're thinking, or of a fear of an afterlife that would be so much longer than this current life, yes, we can put ourselves in some really non-beneficial positions within, to my knowledge, the one life that we do have. So I get that being on the personal side. But I also wonder, let me ask you this as the question. If someone left the harmful parts of Islam and they were living a really peaceful and successful life where they had great family and friends, but they still had this belief in Allah, would you take any issue with that? Would you care at all that they believe something you find to be untrue, or with a religion that you find to be maybe one with a baggage of harm? Or as long as they are healthy, you really don't care? You don't have an opinion on it?
For the most part, as long as they're healthy, I don't care how they live their life. But there's always that concern of, for example, are they using that version of Islam to promote Islam in general?
So that was going to be my next question. Yes, is should we care that the non-fundamentalist side of these two big religions, Christianity and Islam, even though they can be almost beneficial in some regards, they absolutely are to certain individuals in certain communities. But if they are making way for the other parts, they are keeping those going. I'm wondering how much you weigh that into your factoring. And I think I cut you off as you were getting there, but
That's okay. Yeah, that's the part that concerns me, because the problem is when they advocate for other people to join, or they make the claim that this is actually what truly the religion is about, and what you're criticizing is some perversion of the religion. So essentially, it's invalidating your criticism of the religion by claiming that you're criticizing a straw man of the religion, when you're actually criticizing what is the most common version in many cases. That does concern me. And if they were to do it in such a way that they would say, create a new book, or to cut out the parts that are not good, and just make a new version, that I'd be more okay with if it was explicitly defined as this is a new revised version of the religion. But unfortunately, when it comes to Islam, that is next to impossible, at least in my lifetime, because it puts a heavy emphasis on how allegedly preserved it is, and how it's the final revision and you can't really improve on perfection. So people who have that position of some kind of progressive, or selectively taking the good parts and leaving the bad parts out, I don't think that's viable within the religion itself, but I'm not going to go and try to convince them that that's not viable. I just don't like it when they try to convince others that it is viable.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It is the concern that I face. I mean, I think about this on a daily basis. It's been hard for me to criticize certain parts of Christianity, because as Christians actually display them, they're not following the literature so closely that they're actually doing the harm that I'm talking about that comes. Do you find that in Muslim communities at all, a distinction between this very fundamentalist side and this more real world, watered down version?
I do. And in Muslim communities, the distinction can be huge. You can have two extremes on that spectrum, and both sides think that they're right, both sides of the extreme. So, You have progressive Muslims or casual Muslims who think that anything that looks bad in Islam is probably a misunderstanding or not really the true thing. But if they would even look at fundamentalist Islam and say that's not Islam, that's akin to maybe even a cult or terrorism or something. That's not really what the religion is about. They would be very surprised or shocked to learn that some of these elements are common with what the Prophet and his followers themselves had done, but it's hard for them to be receptive to that information. And the harms of Islam also, I find, can be more subtle. So it's not just about the extremes. Even the progressive believers, because of how deeply entrenched the religion is in everyday life, and how it's not just a religion, it's a way of life. It goes into every decision you make and everything that you do. It's referenced in every sentence almost. So it's a lot more, from my perspective at least, it's a lot more deeply rooted than Christianity can be. So that makes it harder to question. And it also means that even the most subtle influences can cause harm.
Can you explain that more to me? I from my interactions with Muslim communities, I would agree that there is this more inherent built into the culture the religion is than, say, in Christianity. You might have a progressive, kind of even moderate Christian that goes a week without talking about God to anyone around them. Yeah, they go to church, but then they're at their job and they're doing their hobby. And yeah, they might have a moral compass that they believe is built off of these biblical standpoints, but it's not this, like, it's not a huge part of their vocabulary. It's not this living out daily. But I have seen, even with what I would consider to be more progressive Muslims, it is just ingrained fully. Like, every blessing, every thank you, every greeting somehow ties back in religiously. But you would have obviously so much more information on that. What does that look like, in your opinion, the difference between Christians and Muslims in that regard?
I think you explained it pretty well. I mean, that's one thing that was a shocker to me when I first moved to the West, so to speak. And I realized that most people were non-religious. Even the ones who do go to church, you wouldn't know that they go to church, for the most part, because it's not the topic that comes up all the time. But with Muslims, it's not just around non-Muslims. It's not a way of introducing people to the religion. It's just the way that they talk and they think. Every sentence, like you said, it's deeply entrenched in the vocabulary. Like when you want to make plans with someone and you say, hopefully I'll be there, you say, inshallah, God willing, I'll be there, and things like that, to the point that even people aren't doing it for religious reasons. It's just what they do. And I don't think they realize that it influences them back into accepting religion as a fact of life, even if they're not practicing it.
Yeah, it does kind of make it this implicit truth that even if you start deconstructing from some of the more maybe extreme or traditional ideas, it's harder, I would assume, to think, well, this God can't just not exist because it's just such a part of everything. I actually wonder, I don't know, what is your experience with Christianity?
I've come across the odd Christian here and there back in the Middle East, but I never really actually encountered a Christian society. So when I first moved, I think my first encounter was the people giving out flyers, to tell you about Christ. But even then, they weren't very pushy about it, and I wasn't even sure what they were trying to sell me, so to speak, because they make it very vague now, so that you're not turned off the moment that you see something with a cross on it. Like it's
some spots of the country they make it vague, and some I think they lean in. But yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's what I noticed, because it gets you just curious enough to be like, wait, what is that? And I was always very polite and also curious, so I always took the flyers just to look at what's going on. What are they giving people? But they weren't too pushy about it. And I've been to one event in a church, and I was confused that there would be an event in a church and they don't even talk about religion at all. Like, a friend was singing in a choir, I think it's called, and it was odd to me that it had nothing to do with religion. They were just using it as a building with good acoustics. And I'm sure that mosques do host events as well, but there's always a religious undertone to them. I never stepped into a mosque and not felt like I'm in a mosque. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But in a church, it just feels like I'm in a big fancy building sometimes. My other exposure to Christianity was actually at a Coptic church. So I had a friend from the Middle East who was Christian, at least in name. He wasn't really practicing, but he still went to church for the community aspect, and he invited me to an event, and it was all games and food and stuff, and it was really fun. And I don't think I've experienced something like that in the Middle East in a mosque.
I will say Christians have a pretty good marketing plan of getting people in the door, and we'll deal with the rest later. The reason I asked you for your experience in Christendom so far was I wonder if it's harder to deconvert from Islam or from Christianity. And I don't think it's an important question, but it's one that's interesting to me because on the one hand, with Islam, we were talking about like it's built into the vocabulary. It's so much more, I would say, when people believe, they tend to display their beliefs stronger than some types of Christians. Again, we're painting with really broad brushes right now, and I'm not wanting to offend either side in any capacity. Because as you talk about some of your experiences with this lighter version of Christianity, a tract that's somewhat vague, or an event at a church that's not really talking about it, I also have memories completely to the opposite of, street preachers chasing you down the street, trying to prophesize over you, laying hands on you, people just knocking on your door every day, asking you to go to church, and things of this nature that are extremely socially acceptable within the Christian side of things. So I think that probably both sides can do a lighter version or a heavier version when it comes to their conversion ethics. But I do wonder which one it's harder to get away from, which one ingrains itself into you deepest. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, and I have an answer, but it's not a definitive answer. I think, of course, it depends on every person's situation. You could have a Christian who is facing a lot of difficulty with conversion, and a Muslim who deconversion, and a Muslim who leaves it very easily. That can happen. But I think it tends to be the other way around, that it's very difficult to deconstruct from Islam just because of how immersed you are in it. Imagine the experiences that you've had, but them being common across entire countries, not just regions within the US, for example, or smaller towns or the South or whatever the region might be, the Bible Belt. Imagine that, but on the scale of countries. That's how it feels to me to be Muslim. And you don't recognize that there's something too pushy about it because that's just the norm. For example, back when I was in Saudi Arabia, I don't think that's the case now. I think it's changed. But back then, for the prayers 5 times a day, when it was time to pray, all the shops would close down. Even a gas station would refuse to serve you till prayer time was over. There used to be a time where there even this kind of morality police, I suppose, but for religious police that would drive around and take you to the mosque if they see you around during prayer time. That's not to say that the entire Middle East is like that, but that's just an example of how it's kind of what you're describing, but on a large scale. But even when it comes to people who grew up in moderately religious families, the moderately religious in the Muslim world look a lot more fanatical to a Christian, than the moderately Christian in the Christian world. It's a huge part of life. So I think it's very difficult to deconstruct from that. But then again, it varies on an individual basis.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it is, of course, individual, because some people will have pressures put on them or certain kinds of family members that have driven something home so deeply or used certain kinds of fear tactics. And when I said fear tactics, I wanted to just kind of address it. You're wearing a mask here, and I didn't do a good job taking a second to kind of explain your background, but obviously you are ex-Muslim. Would you consider yourself to be atheist or agnostic then?
Are they mutually exclusive?
They don't have to be. I consider myself an atheist agnostic or an agnostic atheist because I'm agnostic in general. I have no idea. There could be a God. Of course, we can't say that there's not. But when it does come to certain religions, certain God concepts that have been put forth as a potential answer. So to that end, I'm completely atheistic, but in general, I consider myself an agnostic.
I feel similarly about those labels. I'm an atheist in the sense that I don't believe in any defined ideas about God, but I also think that the idea of God itself is a man-made idea in any capacity. It's not like we're aware of a God idea independently of humans. If not for humans, we wouldn't know of the idea of God. So I don't want to say that I'm agnostic in the sense that I admit there might be a big guy up in the sky. What I mean by agnostic is I don't know what is beyond my comprehension. I don't know how some people take the positive assertion that there is no God, there is no guy up there, there is no creator. I don't know if we can know. But I think that people who say that are saying it as a reaction to those who assert that we do know that there is a creator.
I think that's also really fair to look at when sometimes it is just the reaction. It is having to err on the other side because it's very hard to actually get across middle ground.
Yeah, because you don't want to sound like a fence sitter or that you're giving some kind of validity to the claim that there might be a God. Just like you, I don't believe in these gods that were sent by religion. And I don't know what else could be out there.
No, I think that's fair. And that's just one part in me doing a better job introducing you. I wanted to understand exactly your thought process, but maybe tell us just really quick, let's take a cut break here and tell us your background, how long you were in Islam, what started your deconstruction process, and let's talk about that for a little bit.
Sure. I don't tell people a lot about the specifics of my background for safety reasons, but I am from the Middle East. I grew up there and I moved out to go to college. I grew up Muslim. And like I explained earlier, everyone around me was Muslim almost. Everything around me asserted Islam as the real, true religion. So for the longest time, I understood that there were other religions out there, but I couldn't understand why they wouldn't just accept the truth. But I grew up with a religious upbringing, a moderate one, mind you. Like we did a lot of things at home that were not explicitly haram, but not explicitly disallowed. But a fundamentalist family would have disallowed them just to be safe. That's not how it was in my home. But I did learn Quran from a very young age because in Muslim families, there's sometimes an emphasis on memorizing and learning how to read it in a way that is pleasing to the ear and that follows certain rules. And that's what I learned from a young age. That doesn't make me an authority on religion or anything. It's not like I took a degree in Islamic studies, but I was fairly well exposed to the ideas of religion from a very young age. And I was always curious about them, more so than other Muslims around me. So I've had questions for as long as I can remember. They just weren't explicitly doubts at the time because the concept of doubting that Islam is true didn't exist yet. Like I said, I was aware of the existence of the outside world, but I didn't give it any legitimacy.
So what did you think when you heard of the outside world in that regard? That there's these other people that believe this and there's people that don't believe anything. When you were first introduced to that sometime in your childhood with such a strong belief and indoctrination from the get-go, where did you put that in your mind to make it make sense?
So firstly, I didn't hear about people who don't believe anything. I don't remember when I first came across the concept of an atheist, probably in my late teens. But from a young age, that wasn't really a thing in my head, except in religious stories, about people who opposed the prophets and so on. But in real life, I didn't think about them very much. I asked about Christians and how come they don't believe like us, because I was told that Islam was was from the same God as Christianity, and it was sort of a revision of it because Christianity got corrupted along the way. I asked, why did Christianity get corrupted along the way? Why didn't God just, make it not corrupted like Islam? And there's no really straight answer for that. It's because humans corrupted it. But anyway, I was confused about why Christians wouldn't join the revision of their religion. It didn't dawn on me till many years later that from their perspective, Islam is just making claims about Christianity. Islam is not actually from the same God, from a Christian's perspective at least. And when it came to polytheists, I was taught to see them as nonsensical. How could you believe in more than one God? Wouldn't they fight with each other? That doesn't make any sense. The example that they always give is, can a ship have two captains? Which ironically, I think a ship has multiple, but so I thought I kind of looked down on polytheism for a while. But after a few years, like in my teenage years, I started asking, doesn't God know what people are going to do and when they're going to do it and whether they're going to end up believers or disbelievers or believers in another religion? So why would God distribute our fates that way? If I was born into a Christian family, would it be my responsibility to find Islam and then join it? And I was told, yeah, that is your moral duty. And I just couldn't accept the idea that all those people, billions of people around the world throughout the history of time, are going to go to hell because they were born in the wrong families, or that they're expected to go out of their way to join my religion. So it took me a long, long time to come to terms with how these questions are valid. And there's nothing wrong with me for thinking that way.
I think that has got to be one of the first things many people think. Many people don't go further than that. It's just this issue. It's just weird. Well, what about everyone else? How is it fair? And at least in Christianity, we have the great apologetic of general revelation, that just via creation, we are without excuse at understanding the Creator and who He is and His true nature and things of this nature, in terms of if you don't happen to live in a time or place where Christianity is the popular and accessible religion, does Islam have any kind of standard apologetic for that same principle?
Yes, something similar. So that question was asked even back during the days of the Prophet or after his death. And the answer back then, or the question was, what about the people who existed between prophets or before the prophet? And the answer was that those people, they have a name, Ahl al-Fatra, meaning people of the period. And those people will be either, the answer is either that they're judged based on their actions and their deeds, which is how I prefer it would be anyway. You know,
Right.
belief shouldn't have anything to do with it. Or they will be tested in the afterlife. What that looks like, nobody knows. But I imagine if I was resurrected and an angel was asking me if I believe in God, my answer would probably be yes. I think what they mean to say is there's some sort of quality that's deep within you, that's in your soul, that had you been presented with the religion, if you're a bad person, you would have rejected it. And a good person would not reject it. They don't explicitly say that, but that's what I'm getting from it. And they carry that explanation forward to what's happening now, where, you know, if you, for example, you did not grow up with a favorable idea or possibly any idea about Islam, so you weren't properly introduced to the religion, so you'd have that sort of treatment where either you'd be tested in the afterlife or God would just look at your deeds and that's it.
I've heard this actually recently from, there's a few Muslims that seem to watch my channel for whatever reason. I think they're trying to collect those Christians that are falling off the Christian bandwagon and show them the truth. And I've heard similar things that, you know, Brandon, being in the West, being a white male that grew up in the 90s in, you know, Bible Belt territory, you surely have an incorrect idea about Allah. You surely have an incorrect idea about what Islam really is. And so, you know, you've never even tried. You've never even tried to speak to Allah. You've been under a false god this whole time. And some of it seems to be, as they say this to me, and I've seen them say it to people in the comments, an allowance of like, hey, it's not your fault. You were set up incorrectly, but hey, now you do have a responsibility. And if you're being smart enough to leave this false god, as many people in the comment sections are alluding to, then now's the time that you can be introduced to the correct one. And I think that crossover is so funny because so many people leaving Christianity, yeah, some are ready to jump to a different god. And I'd like to ask you what you have seen most common when people leave Islam. But I think most people that leave Christianity, they're kind of done. Some people hold on to some new age spiritualism. Some people, you know, maybe get really in touch with like pantheism or panpsychism or something like that. But most, I think, jump all the way to like the straight atheist category because they've been so indoctrinated to this one God concept and this holy book that is inspired that once those fall down, they're like, no, of course the Quran is also wrong. Of course, Allah being from the same root is also wrong. Do you find that when people do eventually, and if they are able to leave Islam, that they kind of go strict atheist, or have you seen a lot of exploring other religions or other ideas?
I can't speak for the numbers because I don't have the numbers, but just based on anecdotal evidence, what I see is that kind of like myself, no, you're done with the whole idea, more or less. Like not everyone's a hard atheist, but they're done with the idea of revealed religion from God. But however, this idea of criticizing Islam openly or admitting that people are leaving Islam is a very, very new one. We're talking like decades old, like within just the past few decades, at least on a large scale. And the people that first start doing it, among them were Christians who were criticizing the religion of Islam. And like you mentioned, kind of people who fall off the bandwagon, they would then take to their camp. And they should be applauded for, in some ways, being pioneers in the area of criticizing Islam, but not necessarily for their goals or, you know, what they end up doing. And we see that on the English speaking side of ex-Muslim YouTube, so to speak, one of the biggest content creators in this space to this very day pairs up with a Christian preacher. And it's very concerning because the Christian preacher and a big part of their audience, their biggest motivation, like you said, motivation matters, is to see this evil religion get taken down and to take people into their camp, which I think is very predatory, even if the intention is to save them, because I know that people aren't doing this necessarily out of malicious reasons. So yeah, there's that tension between Islam and Christianity that I keep seeing. But thankfully and hopefully, most people who leave Islam, hopefully they know better than to join another religion, at least not when they're in a vulnerable stage of their deconstruction, and to take some time to think about what they used to believe and how that might be similar to what they're adopting now.
Yeah, I think both religions are similar enough that the reasons people believe or say they believe and the adherence to a holy book of some kind, even though there's some stark differences between the Quran and the Bible as it's put together, I think that it leads to a kind of thinking that as soon as you can unravel it a bit, yeah, you're not as likely to fall for the other side. But what I am seeing all the time, and one thing I wanted to ask you is, first of all, Islam is growing and Christianity is dying. At least that's my understanding according to the polls and the numbers. Islam is at like 1.8, 1.9 billion believers, and that number is going up. And Christianity is at like 2.3 billion, but that number is going down. And so I think I've seen different projected years, but something like maybe 2070, Islam becomes the biggest, most populated religion. So I'd like to ask, first of all, why do you think Islam is growing when Christianity is dying, even though both are subject to the same things? You have people on YouTube, you have all this open space now, you have people that are willing to stand up like yourself and say this is wrong. Why, though, is one side growing and one is not?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're subject to the same things at all,
Okay.
At least not to the same scale. I mean, you and I exist, but as you can see, someone in my position has to be a bit more concerned about their safety. Not saying that, people in your position don't get any threats,
Yeah.
but it's in the Muslim world, for example, there are people who do what I do, but from within the Middle East, and they get jailed, or they go on the run because they will get jailed if they get caught. Islam is really protected by the Muslims because the way that it's ingrained into society, there's so many mechanisms aside from violence against people who leave or being ostracized or laws that are against it. Just the fact that people are so used to it and they pride themselves on this. When you say that Christianity is dying, Muslims take that as a sign that Islam is true. And we should never have the same fate as the Christians. It's a reason for them to double down. But the reason that it's growing is simply, aside from everything I mentioned, is birth rates. Mm-hmm. People are born Muslim and counted Muslim till they die. To this very day, my national ID in my home country says that I'm Muslim. So I'm part of that statistic. If it were more open, if people were allowed to leave without consequences, if they weren't vilified for not believing, then those numbers would look very different. And I don't know what these projections took into account, but I'm hoping that the age of technology and international relations and connections is going to change that trajectory a little bit, or at least amend the way that we think of Muslims. Being ex-Muslim or non-Muslim doesn't have to mean that you have to be at odds with Muslims. You can live among them. You just don't have to be counted as one. And right now, everyone gets counted as a Muslim.
It's interesting to me, though, for the growing part that you mentioned, it's just birth rates. Do you think that it also seems to me, and it could be anecdotal or it could just be bias of what's put in front of me on YouTube, but it does seem like Islam is spreading even from a conversion standpoint, especially into some of the more European countries and things like that. What do you attribute that to? And I know you're not like a speaker for all matters, but I'm curious anecdotally, like what you have noticed there and what you might attribute it to.
So when it comes to conversions, they do happen, but unfortunately nobody follows up with the converts afterwards, a few months after or a few years down the line.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But especially in Islam, unfortunately, there's a fetishization of white people joining Islam. Like you see converts of all races and backgrounds, but especially when they're white, and this is almost universally a truth in Muslim communities, they are celebrated and they're treated with such love. They're love bombed essentially. And many people in vulnerable positions join Islam because they think that it's a way to fix their life, or it's a fresh start at life, and it's kind of exotic, and sometimes they join because they know Muslims and they're very nice people, especially towards them as potential converts, or because they see right now, for example, injustice happening around the world that is happening to a population that is predominantly Muslim, and somehow they feel like they have an affinity for that population or an affinity for Islam as a result. It's unfortunate, to be honest, that war and tragedy has caused a lot of extra, good promotion for Islam. There are a lot of preachers who have hijacked these tragedies to spread a religious message for some reason. So you see conversion for a lot of reasons, and I'm not saying that every convert is not valid for the reasons that they chose, but there's a lot more going than just people convert and they're happy. And a lot of them tend to leave afterwards because they join under somewhat false pretenses. Like they're told that, oh, you have tattoos, you don't wear a hijab, that's okay. You don't have to worry about that stuff. You drink, that's okay for now. And then once you join, they're like, okay, well, you gotta get your head in the game. You gotta do this, you gotta do that. and they start cutting off from other people in their lives, whether intentionally or not. It could be that the people in their lives are concerned about them and they don't want them to become a Muslim, so they cut them off, or the other way around. And a lot of them end up leaving or end up in very bad situations, especially when the conversion happens for the sake of marriage. Because in Islam, the rule is that a Muslim man can marry a Muslim, Christian, or Jewish woman, but I think that he still retains the right to have the kids be Muslim. I mean, that's kind of what the religious law says. A Muslim woman cannot marry any man except a Muslim man. But even Christians and Jews are encouraged to convert to Islam for the sake of the marriage. So that tends to happen sometimes, even under the pretense of, let's just do this for the family, let's just do this to keep the peace sort of thing. So there are a lot of ways that people get into Islam without actually knowing what they're getting into.
That's very astute. I think you pieced apart a few things there that it's funny because I just keep, I think one of the neat things we can do is compare and contrast Christianity and Islam, and especially leaving. And Christianity does some of these things like love bombing its new believers just to leave them out. They just wanted the number. Our ranks are growing. I did my job. I planted the seed. I saved a soul. All the things they can raise their hand about in church and count as good works for themselves. But there is a special kind of feeling or credit that you get as a Christian when you convert a Muslim or a Hindu. Someone from a more exotic religion, someone that wasn't just a non-believer that grew up in the States and knows about our God and finally got their act together. No, these people were deceived. These people were wrong. And now I have been able to show them the true God. These people have a different skin color and now they're a Christian like me. And there is this same kind of thing that you had described. And maybe I have a bias there because my mother was a missions director, and all we had in our house growing up constantly were a lot of people from Africa, a lot of people from Asia, and a lot of people from the Middle East that were of different religions that come over here in some kind of a refugee program. And then my mother, as this conduit of, I'll help you with housing, and yes, we'll help you, with culture and language, but you also need to be coming to the church. You need to be coming to this Bible study. You need to be coming to this quiet time, etc. And it was this special victory among the nations to be able to convert people from very different backgrounds, as opposed to just, again, moderate Christian upbringing, finally getting it right. It's funny to see the reversal of that. And even now I can see it. And I'm curious what you think about this. I hear constantly from Christians that want to talk about how they know Christianity is true, is that Jesus, the Christ, is showing up to Muslims in the millions, in visions and dreams. Have you heard this phenomenon that's going on supposedly?
No, but I've heard the opposite sometimes, that it's every group bragging about how they're stealing followers from the other group, basically. And
that's the point I had in bringing it up. It is crazy that we would go out of our way to either invent these stories or hear one and then say it's happening to millions or whatever. And that proves, because, and it's always I don't know if this is what you hear from the other side, but it's always, this group of Muslims, they were so stuck culturally. They had no outside influence. They'd never heard Jesus, which is not true, I'm sure. And yet Jesus shows up in their dreams. Doesn't that prove something?
I even had a caller to one of my live streams. I don't know to this day if he was pretending or not, but he claimed to be a Christian convert from Islam and that he had never heard of Christianity or anything, and has some miracle happened to him and his cousin, and this whole elaborate story that I found very, very difficult to believe. But it frustrates me because if that is how God operates, then God is kind of an asshole, because he has the power, or it has the power, to reveal itself to everyone all at once in an undeniable way. Yet it's playing games, showing up in dreams and showing up for little tiny miracles here and there. What's the point? Why do we have to believe word of mouth instead of actually seeing it?
Especially when the scriptures, at least Christianity wise, tell us how unreliable we are. I've always found this to be one of the biggest jokes, if this God were real, is that the heart is deceitful above all else, that our human minds are not capable of grasping truth, that we need the witness of the Holy Spirit. Essentially just what horrible, dirty, shameful vessels we are of creation. And yet we are God's sole way of spreading his truth. And it's and especially then when you make it even more abstract, because it's always a dream or a vision or a prophecy or something vague. The very fact that it happens from the other side is then it cancels out, because obviously one of you is lying. And if one of you is lying, we can assume the other is being willing to lie, or under the same incorrect impression, if you want to give them the best benefit of the doubt. But as soon as you start to hear that and be exposed to that, which is why I think getting multiple perspectives is so powerful, you can start to do that. Oh, they're being told the same thing. Oh, there's the same example here. What would make it more true for me than them? And that was my biggest start. As soon as I couldn't answer anymore, why would their personal experience and it took a while. Many Christians never get the chance to meet a Muslim. I really believe that here in the States. And maybe that'll change. But growing up, if my mother had not been a missions director, never. It just wouldn't have happened. There was no other situation in which it would. And because of that exposure, and I'd start hearing them talk about how much they believed or used to believe, and all these things that happened to them, and their version of struggling with the spiritual warfare, and their version of hearing from God and feeling the presence of something stronger. And to really believe that at least they believe that, even if I don't, for them, I feel that way too. And that's my evidence. So either all humans are capable of having this bad evidence, or one of us is untruthful. And I couldn't continue the Christian thing of they're lying. No, they're sincere. They're sincerely wrong, but they're sincere. So do you ever have any experiences? I know that it sounded like it was a more closed circle for you growing up, but where your perspective kind of got infiltrated by some other culture, some other religion, and you had to map this on?
No, it was only when I was a young adult that I started to be exposed to people from other walks of life. And I had the same question of, they don't seem like the insincere, intentional liars that we think of.
Or
because
that you were warned about?
Yeah. Or even in Islam, the concept of a kafir, which means disbeliever, it comes from the meaning of the word is someone who hides the truth. So what we understand about kuffar is that they know that the religion is true, but they choose to defy because they love the worldly stuff too much, or because they are arrogant, or some other reason. I don't think most sane people would give God the finger and say, I believe that you're real. I know exactly what is going to happen to me if I don't obey you, but I'm gonna disobey you anyway because I'm a little brat. That's not how it works. And the more that I met people, whether they're Christian, gay, Hindu, whatever it may be, just something that my religion disapproves of, I realized they wholeheartedly believe, just like I used to wholeheartedly believe. And I had that question for a lot of sheikhs in my deconversion journey, which I didn't know was my deconversion journey at the time. And I asked them, if I were from another background, if I was a believer in a similar a different idea, or a non-believer at all, how would you pitch this to me in a way that is self-evident or cannot be disproved, a way that is absolutely surefire, provable, and also in a way that is different than every pitch from every other religion? And I seldom found any answers except focusing on the intricacies of little details that are unique to Islam. So they get to say, look, this thing proves the truth. For example, how the book has been preserved. No other book has been preserved. Therefore, that means that Islam is true. Right. They find the unique qualities and then make them the fundamentals for what truth is.
That's so very true. Christianity's big one that they do in that same vein is, oh, this is the only religion ever that isn't works-based in any capacity. Therefore, it's true. And not only is it untrue that that's the only religion that's ever had that, but you even brought up earlier, that's actually a really bad plan. That setup is terrible, that it's not based off who we are, what we do, or what we choose to do. That it's just having the right defense attorney or scapegoat at the end. Yeah, I think each religion does look for what is unique, and then that just becomes the thing that supposedly proves it. But so far, I haven't actually found anything in any religion that is inherently unique. I can't think of one. There's other religions that definitely have a savior. There's other religions that also, to your point with Islam, have a holy text or an oral tradition or something that has been preserved, that has been very standard for its entirety. And on that line, I'm curious, this is just a fun question, I think, for any atheist. What, if anything, would be the best evidence for you that you're wrong and that there is a personal God that wants a relationship for you?
I never really know exactly how to answer that question, because the easy answer, and I don't mean it to be a cop-out, but the easy answer is God would know exactly what it would take.
This is most famous by Matt Dillahunty, and I've also parroted this same kind of line for sure. And that's true, and it should be true.
I am not able to conceptualize what it is to be a God, or what it is to create things, and then to desire their worship. From my perspective, if I created the entire universe, I don't think I'd need the worship. And even if I liked it, I wouldn't punish in the absence of it. But I'm a human. So I don't know what God is thinking or how it thinks. But I know that God is capable of presenting itself in a way that cannot be disputed. Because right now, every way that God has presented itself, or that we're told that God has presented itself, is disputable and it's not proof. It's not like measuring gravity, it's not repeatable. You can't confirm that it's actually happening. You have to believe and have faith. So the question for me always becomes, what is the virtue of believing without seeing? Why does God want you to obey without actually verifying first? Because that seems to be something that you get a lot of brownie points for in Islam. Like it's better if you weren't there for the miracles. Is gullibility the virtue here? How easily you believe something without evidence?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be. And, us talking about that rationally and logically, like I can already hear the believers on both sides saying, no, that's what separates it. It is that you have to take this leap. That's the beautiful part about the connection with the Almighty, the On High, the other side is the mystery, which no one just says, I believe out of pure blind faith. They try to tell you they believe because they know it's true, because they have a personal relationship, because they witnessed a miracle, because they felt the presence of the Holy Spirit or whatever the equivalent is. And you just can't have it both ways. Like either there is this evidence that convinced you and you're telling me it is, and then you should be able to duplicate it for me, or this God should be willing to duplicate it for me. But as long as everything is vague, anecdotal, and personal, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I think there should be a way that even the most cold-hearted, hard atheist scientist, would join the religion, because there's no other way of concluding but that God exists and this is what God said. But that's not how it is right now. And I think it's mighty irresponsible of God to basically ask for us to believe using the same mechanism in so many different religions, and only one of them is true. And if you follow the other ones, you're a bad person who deserves his wrath. I can't comprehend that. And perhaps, this is why I say I'm agnostic. Perhaps that God does exist. Perhaps that God is kind of lying about some of what's in their religion, because it can't be all merciful and all, knowing and all that kind of stuff, and also simultaneously be a liar. But it could be a liar. I can't definitively prove that that's not the case, but I can't definitively prove so many other things either. And I don't live as if they exist. So that's my best bet, that God is just a human idea.
I think that's the hard thing for people that are still in the religion at all. Once they start to have this understanding that maybe they're wrong, the difference between people like us who I think take it all the way to its natural conclusion and people that still kind of remain in it, even in the stage of doubting or issue, is that they are just like, well, what's the alternative? Like there has to be something here. Or, maybe I'm wrong about the nature of God. Maybe, and they let go of things in pieces. Maybe the Bible isn't inerrant. Maybe this God doesn't actually love everyone. I had a good Christian friend, the only other person that went through a questioning process that I know of personally. All of my other friends have just been steadfast since birth. And he didn't end up fully deconstructing or deconverting, I should say. But in his deconstruction, he came to the conclusion of, oh, wow, no, God can't possibly love everyone. And I don't understand how to reconcile that. And I don't know how it's fair. But I know that he's real, and I know that he does want a relationship with me. So, that's my truth. And it's like, well, at least you're honest, but doesn't that portray a kind of God that you wouldn't want a relationship with? And so many people, I just think, can't let the last domino fall. And so I'd like to investigate a little bit more into your personal deconversion story. What was the age in which you started to really deconstruct? How long did it take to get to your full deconversion? Walk me through it a little bit.
The questions I've had since I was a child, and they became incessant and naggy when I was around maybe 15 or so, plus or minus a couple of years. I don't remember exactly. My questions about how can God predestine everything and know everything in advance, and also say that we have free will, and also put a moral responsibility on us. And that's not a question about, to let me get away with committing crimes or harming people. It's about belief, and about people who are going to die as non-believers in the correct religion. That's all predetermined, or if not predetermined, pre-known. God would know about it. So why would God have emotions about it? Because you can't be angry or upset or happy about something that happened thousands of years ago, or in God's perspective, God created time. So it was just difficult for me to wrap my head around.
I think most people start with less mature issues than free will. So I think that's cool. But yeah, keep going.
It is cool, but it's also tormenting. And that's something that I touch on in my next video. I talk about how religious thinking has harmed my mental health. And one of those ways is that it made me an overthinker. I wanted to get ahead of this. I wanted to answer that question before I die, because there was that ticking time bomb of the day of judgment or death, or heaven and hell. And I didn't understand how people around me could just go on with life casually, being like, oh, there are things we don't know. It's fine. There are billions of people who are going to hell forever, but it's not my problem. The big guy upstairs has it covered. Even though I understood that God has it covered and God knows what is fair, it was obviously so unfair that I just couldn't accept the answer. I wanted to know how it was fair, or at least push me in the right direction. And I get that answer that it's too arrogant to expect to know how God thinks, or there are things beyond our comprehension, and so on. But I'm not asking to understand how everything in the universe works. I'm asking about something that is fundamental to the belief in God itself, or in this specific God. If it weren't so fundamental to the belief, I would put it aside and say, well, God can handle that. But if you have a God that is lying about being all merciful and all knowing, then either it's a lie or it doesn't exist. So it was a very urgent question for me. And I ran into a lot of difficulties with believers around me at that time, especially family members who, they weren't upset at me for asking questions, but they were frustrated that I wasn't able to accept theirs. And I quickly realized that it would cause me a lot of friction if I continue to ask the questions. So I shelved them for a bit.
When you were asking those questions originally to family or friends, was it seen as, oh, he's going through that stage where people want to know more? We're not in fear of losing him. These questions are not that scary. Here's an answer. Oh, I'm kind of frustrated you don't like my answer, but we're all fine. Or was it like, oh no, you're asking these questions. Let me try to shut this down and never do this again. Like, what was the actual reaction like to your investigating?
Well, it was a bit of both, because I think they were used to me asking questions from a very young age. Like, I remember when I was younger than 10, I asked, what was there before the earth?
Right.
Before God created the earth. And I was trying to visualize what it looked like. What does nothingness mean if space is already empty? What is emptier than empty?
Right.
So I've always asked these questions, and a lot of specific questions about Islam, or about the stories of the prophets. So I don't think it was concerning at first, but when it was difficult for me to accept the answers of God knows best and all that, I think there was a bit more of like, you need to shut this down because this is a dangerous way to think. And we're worried about you being by yourself if you leave, this country, if this is where your head's at. I think I also had other stuff going on because I'm a teenager, and I had exams, I had school, I had a social life, I had sports. So I shelved it for long enough to then leave that environment. Not on purpose, but I had to go to school, and I chose somewhere that was far away, not on purpose. It was just the best option for me. And the more that I got exposed to people from other walks of life, the more that I had to struggle with my own beliefs, because people were very friendly and they'd ask me, oh, are you a Muslim? And not in an unfriendly way, but just to get to know me better. And I would say it's complicated. And that was scary, because I'm supposed to say yes, and I'm proud of being a Muslim, but I wasn't proud of it. And I felt like I'd be lying if I said yes, but I'd be lying if I said no. So what was I? And it took many, many years, maybe 5 or 6 years, to actually more seriously question it. I just kept flip-flopping between practicing and then feeling guilty when I don't practice. In that time, I had sometimes committed sins or done things that were not allowed in religion, and I felt extremely terrible and guilty about them. So I wasn't, I hadn't left it yet. And I didn't even know that it was an option to leave, because all I knew of people who left the religion were not really people who left it, but essentially, oh yeah, there's this cousin of a cousin who moved to this country and married a white girl and is non-religious now. Yeah. Like there's this negative stereotype that we're chasing some other lifestyle or looking up to another civilization, and we were trying to copy them. And that's why people don't follow Islam anymore. But it wasn't that way for me at all. I didn't idolize people around me. I just realized that they're very similar to me, just in a different part of the world, and they don't deserve to go to hell. What really broke my faith completely, or got me to investigate to a point where my faith broke, was when I was in a relationship with someone, and it was serious and I wanted it to continue. And there's this classic move that a lot of Arab/Muslim guys do, where it's like, hey, by the way, I know we've been dating for a while, but you got to convert to my religion. Or we've been dating for a while, but I can't do this because it's not okay with my religion. And then they completely dump the person. I didn't want to do either of those things. So I wanted to know, if I'm inviting that person into my religion, what exactly am I pitching here? Am I just saying, let's do it for the family? Or am I saying, this is what I believe. I think you should believe the same thing, so we both be happy in heaven together. And then I had to face all my questions and all my doubts head on. And the more that I searched, the more that I asked, I tried to do it the right way, with guidance and everything. I didn't want to just go on Google and lead myself astray. I spoke to so many different faith counselors and sheikhs from different parts of the world and different denominations of Islam almost. And I found that it was almost shocking to me. These guys don't know. They don't know the answer. I looked up to them as if they are the holders of knowledge, but they told me as much as my family members did. It's not that my family members were unqualified. That was the first time that it really dawned on me. What if they're all wrong? And I hadn't thought of that possibility before. And then it took me years to go through deconstruction, I suppose, in a more focused way. And, for a while, it was all I can think about, because how can I get back to this normal life? I want to know what happens. Am I going to hell? Am I going to heaven? Is any of this worth pursuing? And then years later, I found myself not even done with my deconstruction. I found myself on a live stream on a YouTube channel. And then that's how I started my own channel, not with the intention of being a voice in this space, but sort of out of necessity, that I don't see a lot of people doing it, not to discredit anyone who does do it, but there's always the need for more and more variety. And that's kind of how I got here.
Man, I have so many questions. There's so many different ways I want to take it. The thing that stands out to me is I'm absolutely amazed at the similarities, not just between us, but between every single person I hear that goes through this process. And I'm so glad to have someone on like you to share, even from another religion that goes through this I don't want to use the word standard because it is so individualistic, but there are certain core stepping stones that I think anyone that leaves their faith goes through. That initial questioning phase, that hiding it phase, that impossible dissonance when you're balancing between the two, trying to lean back in and just fake it till you make it. And then there's usually the catalyst. For me, it was the same as you, it slightly different. Once I had children and I realized I was going to be responsible for what I taught them, and that I needed to, I always believed it to my core. And I even was deep in apologetics. I thought I had an answer for everything. But as I wanted to have the best, the most truthful answer for everything ahead of time before I would teach my kids, that's what made me think, oh man, I need to actually finally take that thing off the shelf and deal with it. What is the answer to slavery in the Bible, free will, problem of whatever it was? But I hope that people who are hearing this are encouraged that it's sincere. That's what I get from you and from many people is you wanted to do it the right way. You weren't trying to run away to sin. You were sorry for your sin. If you had actually wanted to sin, it would be easier to just stay where you were so you could have some method of forgiveness. And it's just sincere. You wanted to be truthful to the people that were important in your life. And I love that. So I commend you for that. How long was the total process then from 15 to I'm 100% sure Allah is not correct?
At least a decade.
Wow. Yeah.
Something like that, maybe a bit shorter. And it was very gradual, and it wasn't a well-defined process. As you know, these things happen in phases. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it took me a long time.
Did you have a phase of almost denying the truth where you were pretty sure it wasn't real, but you tried to convince yourself to just go back in, do what you were supposed to do according to the faith, marry who you were supposed to marry, these kinds of things? Or were you pretty well convinced enough to be able to drop it?
It's a little difficult to answer that because I'm tempted to say that that's just me from a very young age, but it was to the maximum limit of me knowing that it is not true, or me acknowledging that it is not true, which was a low amount at the time. I couldn't acknowledge that. But for as long as I remember, since my teenage years, at least, I had an inkling that there's something wrong here, but I'm going to try to make it make sense anyway. But when it became clear that, oh no, everyone's kind of winging it, there's no actual truth that these people hold that I am not privy to, I don't think I was able to force myself to then do things. Maybe I still prayed to, see if last ditch effort if God would answer my prayers or show me the way. But I didn't remain in that stage for a long time because it felt very disingenuous. I couldn't do it.
I'm curious, you mentioned that it caused you, and I think you said this was negative or could have been negative. Maybe you can clarify. It caused you, being in this religion, to overthink in general. What did you mean by that? And what do you mean by the negative aspect of it or the harm that it's done? Because typically I would think overthinking, analyzing, being skeptical in this is a good thing. So help me understand what you meant by that.
So overthinking almost everything, because the way that it started, perhaps I was always an overthinker, but what I fixated on in my younger years was this idea that God is always watching. And in Islam, obviously, God knows your every thought. He knows everything that you've thought of doing, that you've done, that you didn't do. And there are angels that two angels that sit next to you or on your shoulders. I can't remember the specifics, and they write down every action that you did. And also your own body parts will testify against you on the day of judgment and say, on this day, he did this. And again, that's not my family scaring me. That's not my family saying you better not do bad things because that's what Allah says. That's just what's in the book. And I was exposed to the book from a very young age. And not just because of my Quran classes, but it's everywhere. Like you go to Friday prayer, every Friday there's a sermon. On TV, there's always some kind of religious talk show. And that's, again, the moderate religious experience. So I grew up with this idea that God is always watching. Every thought is recorded, even the thoughts that I will not act on but could be sinful, even those are recorded. So I sort of try to explain in my head or justify every thought that I had. I wanted to get ahead of the judgment in a sense. Like if I had a bad thought, I would think, God, no, I didn't mean it that way. It was just an impulsive thought. I wouldn't act on it, or I understand that this is a bad thing, and so on. So it's like I'm having an inner dialogue all the time. And that's something that stuck with me after leaving religion as well. Even though I don't think that there's a God that's going to, go through every thought that I've ever had, I still have that irrational fear that at any point I could be sort of exposed to the world the way that Allah would have exposed me on the day of judgment. And not just for my bad actions, but just everything. And yeah. That's just one way that it had hurt my mental health.
Yeah, that makes way more sense in terms of the negative aspect of it. I mean, it sounds just like anxiety to the nth degree. The way that I've had anxiety explained to me, and all fear really is just this hypothetical what if that people put themselves in now, right? And to be living in that constantly in such a state of fight or flight, such defenses being up where you have to use your own thoughts to explain away your other thoughts to the invisible creator God that's going to use those thoughts against you on the day of judgment. Like that's a level of insanity that we did not evolve to be able to handle in our brains. And I think it is just like you said, outside of, let's assume, and I'm sure your family loved you very much. You had a supportive community. Everyone actually believed this. No one was trying to sneak you into a cult to take advantage of you or take your money. It was just what the religion was, what the book said, and what you believed that creates internal harm, period. Like just as a natural product of those tenets. And I think that's something that I want people who are in religions to understand, that it doesn't have to be an abuse of something. Like, anytime I point out anything that happened, you commented on my last video where I shared how my youth group tricked us with this faux atheist straw man. And so many people in the comments of that were like, oh, Brandon, look, like you were in a cult. You obviously were in the wrong religion. These people were crazy. They were lying to you. That's not real Christians. Once you make excuses for that kind of stuff, and once you allow the book, which says so many different things and can be utilized in so many different ways to have this power, you simply are going to be in a position where you can be hurt by it, where you wouldn't be otherwise. And so it has nothing to do with Christians or Muslims abusing it. It has to do with what it is in and of itself.
I have some thoughts about that I really am eager to share. So I want to frame it in a way that hopefully if there's a believer listening, they'll see where the disconnect is. They seem to be defending, because I hear that in Islam as well, very often, the same kind of idea that was incorrect Islam, or whoever taught you this is the one that harmed you, or you sort of like brought this on yourself. This is not what Allah asked for, Allah intended, and so on. The disconnect here is that they're defending this sort of hypothetical perfect religion, and that whatever bad happens is because of the corrupted versions of it. The way that I see it as someone who's not religious is that religion is a set of ideas. And as a byproduct, there's going to be a percentage of people who are going to react to it that way, no matter what you do. There is no hypothetical, mythical, perfect form or essence of the religion. All there is what exists in this life. So I see it as people are being harmed. There is no afterlife where God gets to say, you know what? You get extra reward because you suffered extra. That doesn't happen. If God were actually real and capable of creating a perfect religion, it would be capable of creating a religion that doesn't cause these negative byproducts and isn't open to abuse, and even without abuse, that couldn't possibly be used inside someone's mind to harm them that way. But yeah, and I'm sure God is capable of creating that.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because actually, I've kind of posed that back to believers. That's like, why do you think then, if this religion can so easily be abused, that it's still true? And they seem to really believe that this is the best version of it, that God knows there was going to have to be collateral damage. That's really the whole argument with free will, that, because I gave you free will, some will abuse that and they will create evil, but otherwise you would have been a slave robot. And I know both of us know the arguments against that well enough, but so many believers truly believe that somehow God's hands are tied, or to have the kind of world where we can have good things, there also has to be these bad things, this potential abuse. So, quickly, I'm curious, what is your kind of go-to reaction there if a Christian says, no, God is real, this religion is correct, and because of God's grace to give us these good things, of course, there is also going to be bad with it?
I think what I choose to focus on in that, like when I'm going to be communicating these harms that I faced because of Islam, the point isn't to say that because I've faced these harms, or because a percentage of the population is going to face harm, therefore that makes the religion not true. I kind of take it as a fact that the religion has not been proven to be true, therefore I can just assume it is not true. We're discussing real life. We're discussing what's happening on the ground right now. And this is something that other people are going through. And I'd like them to know that they're not alone and it's not unique. And because as believers, we have a very insidious way of explaining to ourselves that this is our fault and it's because I'm deviating from the norm and this is all my responsibility. So even if they remain a believer, but they know that other people have gone through the same thing, that's helpful enough for them. Yeah. So I don't focus too much on the aspect of, therefore this makes your religion untrue. I think that's a distraction because the religion has not been proven true to begin with. Sure. And I'm not in the business of proving it false.
And I've seen even enough of your videos to see that you're consistent with your take there. But also so much of what you point to in your videos, or what we point to in our videos, are the things that do show this religion. Well, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong here. I feel like I've seen stuff from you on your videos where you are pointing out how this can't be, why it would make the religion falsifiable, so to believe. Do you think there's room for that too, that's equally important? Or is your main mission truly just about helping people live their best life, essentially, in the world that we are in reality of?
I get what you're saying. I do think that's important. I just cannot assert with 100% certainty that this makes the religion not true.
Sure. Yeah. We don't have to like it. Just because we don't like something doesn't mean it's not true.
Exactly. But they do use that logic that, there are a lot of good things about this religion, or it helped this person when they converted, therefore it is true. I don't have to explicitly use that logic against them, but I can show people a lot of things that could be improved. I guess implicitly it's as if I'm saying it is not true because Allah said that Islam is perfect and these are imperfections. Mm-hmm. But I don't like to focus on that too much, because if their attention is on this guy is trying to disprove my religion, it's like they're not really listening to what I'm saying.
I like your approach a lot. Again, I think there's been a really unhealthy way that people who have done what we do have done it in the past. I don't want to just throw everyone under the bus. I think there was processes of what this looks like, and first getting out there and being willing to speak. And, there's a lot of people that have done so much good, even if they were a bit sophist or even if they were a bit antagonistic. But I like your approach. My approach also wanted to be gentler, more relationship focused than just tearing something down. What other issues do you think, other than, I called it anxiety, I don't want to put a word on it for you, but the overthinking, that constant narration going on in your head, what other issues do you think might be more specific to Islam as potential byproducts of harm that you want to help people with?
I can't off the top of my head tell you if this is specific to Islam or not. And I don't think it is, but I'll answer it this way anyway. It's also something that I'm talking about in my upcoming video. It's the lack of trust in self. So if you grew up your entire life being told that what you're observing is not actually what you're observing. So the things that you see as flaws in religion are not flaws. You just don't comprehend how they're not flaws. You might grow up not trusting your sense of judgment or trusting that you're right about anything. And that's something that I struggle with, is feeling like I'm always wrong. I'm always an imposter because I am wrong about the reason for existence, about God, about all these things. So that's one way that it can make you feel like you don't fit in all the time everywhere.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, you're right. I don't think that is specific to Islam. I think that is anyone that had to, at some point, tell themselves everything they knew was a lie. And I don't mean to laugh. It's almost just so absurd that so many of us, just by feature of the world and the evolution of religion, have been put in a position where sometime around the time our brain stops developing, we say, wait a second, everything was wrong. And I know a lot of people throw a baby out with the bathwater in these situations, and I do want to talk to you about that as well. But when you are so convinced, finally, and like you said, for you, 10 years before you were really there, but once that moment comes and you're so sure that what you believed previously is as wrong can be, how do you decide who you are, what's real to you, what matters to you, what your values are, what you base your morality off of? I want to talk now kind of post deconversion. Where does that leave you in the landscape, and how did you develop, say, a personal philosophy on life afterwards?
I'm kind of just stumbling through life and trying to figure it out as I go, because I noticed that there are streams that you can fall into when you're in that vulnerable stage, and you kind of adopt a bunch of ideas that all go together. And I don't know if I trust that implicitly. Even if most of these ideas are true, I just don't like the idea that they're packaged for me and given to me to adopt altogether.
Give me an example
Hmm.
of one of these ideas that might even be true and beneficial, but you're not ready to just grab in that vulnerable state right away.
This is not an example for me specifically, but that's one that a lot of Muslims, when they leave religion, they struggle with, is the idea of accepting that being gay is not a bad thing, or that gay people exist and it's natural and they should pursue these relationships in a healthy way, because it's so deeply ingrained in them for religious and cultural reasons that there's something icky and gross and bad and sinful about it. So I guess in a similar vein, it's hard to define, but progressive movements in the West, or let's say left-leaning movements, you have these two streams. Either you become very right-leaning or very left-leaning, and I wouldn't want to adopt either wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
So it's important that you pause and think about what you're about to believe and why. Rather than just taking a side and adopting all of their views. And I wish I could get into more specifics, but these movements aren't even well defined to begin with. It's just, as you know, algorithms that put you in a certain direction. And I guess I'm more left leaning than I am right leaning, but that doesn't mean that every position that's ever taken that is left leaning is one that I take.
No, it's nice to find some kinship there, because I think you're right. Typically, Christianity is thought of as extremely conservative. You're going to vote Republican. You're on the right. And there are some Christians that still vote a little bit more moderate or even liberal on a certain issue. But, when you have to kind of pick the one guy, most default there. And so a criticism I've seen from Christians for people that deconvert is, oh, you're being won over by the liberal woke mob. You just want everything to be allowance. You're throwing, again, the baby out with the bathwater. These good things that might be considered tradition or other parts of conservatism, you're unwilling to look at anymore. And like you, I have just been so stuck in the middle because I've had to reevaluate everything issue by issue. It's not wrong just because it's on the right, and it's not inherently right just because it's on the left now. And so years of my actual deconversion and post-deconversion has been, what do I actually believe about this? And to the credit of believers, it is hard when there's not a grounded thing that just tells you this is right and this is wrong. But I also think once you arrive at what you believe, and not everything needs to be right or wrong, by the way, there's some stuff that's just in the middle or neutral. But once you do the work, outside of having a book that just tells you what to think about it, or a pastor that just tells you what to think about it, I do think there's a beauty there in being able to arrive finally and truly at your own conclusion, even if it's wrong, by the way. There's just some autonomy that you finally get back that maybe you didn't have when still in religion. And by the way, if that is wrong that you arrive at, you're probably also now the kind of person that's willing to reevaluate a year later if you get new information. And so I just think that's such a beautiful benefit, but it's such a hard thing for people that used to just have this guiding light to go through. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree. And I'd like to add that it is a responsibility and it is a chore. It can be difficult. It can be annoying. It can be time consuming. So instead of being overwhelmed that there's all these new positions that I now have to assess and then pick one, you can sometimes not have a position about something if it's not directly influencing your life or other people's lives. You have to prioritize what are the topics that I'm going to think about deeply, and don't have superficial opinions, at least not strongly, unless you've looked into it. So when I get asked about certain positions, sometimes I tell people I'm not sure. And it's not because I'm fence sitting. It's not because I think both sides are good or both sides are bad. I just don't know enough to make an assertion. And I'm too busy right now to look into this. And obviously, that's not a permission for me to not care about any social causes or not participate in your community or other international causes. But you have to prioritize what you can focus on.
So when it comes time for you to investigate something that you used to believe was one way, and I don't even want to give a specific here because like you said, I think it's totally fair to just say, I don't know. And certain things, I need more time on, or I need more exposure, or whatever the case is. But when you do make a decision about what you believe or what you think is right when it comes to a particular issue, political or not, what is your process now? How do you go about determining truth insofar as we can even use that word?
I don't know if there's a very well-defined process, and I don't know exactly what reliable sources of information are there. So my approach is to get as much information as I can from as many different sources as I can, and then think it over and then come up with an assessment. It's not really a process as much as it's an awareness of where I'm getting the information of and why I believe certain things. It's very loosely structured.
No, I agree. I love that. It is more about gaining the awareness, even that you don't know or that you can't know or that you need to be introduced to better sources to help you to know, than it is a specific process. I like that. The big question that you and I probably get all the time, and I'm curious to hear your answer is, okay, you've left religion. How do you define morality? How do you ground morality? What do you think about morality? Is it objective in any sense? Is it subjective? What are the implications of the answer that you give? I'd love to just hear your thoughts.
So the context in which I've been asked that question most of the time is as a trap almost, or a first step to then asserting that religious people have objective basis for morality and irreligious people do not. My first reaction is to think, but religion doesn't make your morality objective. You can just point to something. But it got me thinking a bit deeper about it. Even religious people, they don't follow some kind of objective code of morality as if they're robots. They come up with their own version of, is this moral or not? They have that assessment biologically inside their head without even being aware of it. And I use the same exact mechanism, minus that there's a book that says this is moral and this is not. Like I follow the harm principle, the harm and benefits. Is this harming people? Is this benefiting people? And of course, it's not just purely utilitarian. Like you can't just say that you can't measure deaths or kill more people to save more people or something like that. But it's not as easy to define as people who ask that question from the religious side want you to answer. It's mostly about harm and benefit, but I could be wrong about harm and benefit. And there's obviously emotions involved. There's what I grew up with. There's what's normal around me. But at the end of the day, the point is I'm trying to do good and I'm trying to harm as few people as possible. And I will not follow a rule and have some trust in an entity that says that the rule is good, even if it doesn't look that way. The difference that I find between my idea of morality and some religious people's idea of morality is they'll do something or follow a rule not because it seems most beneficial right now, but because of promised benefits later or because guaranteed benefits that you can't see. That is something I wouldn't do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've been careful as I've thought about my own morality when I was a Christian and then post-Christian. And I don't want to put on a judgment with a broad brush of all Christians. But I think there is something to that point, or to even most believers who have a concept of an afterlife. People act like they love God for his personality, the same way that we would love like an uncle, right? Like, oh, I have an uncle I don't like, but I really love this uncle. Why? Because I have a good connection with him. Why? Because we have similar interests. Why? Because we watched the game together and we laughed at the same, like people talk about God like they love him, they enjoy him, they understand him as a unique entity, and that's why they want to follow his rules, and or they believe that he's a good God and therefore his rules are good and they'll be doing good by following the rules. But I think there has to be a truth in the back of the mind that if you really believe in the concept of heaven, if you actually believe it's a perfect place and it's better there than it is here, and it's forever. You cannot just say that you still care about things on earth to the same degree. You have to be willing to say 70 years on earth, my family, my friends, my job, my career, if I die of poverty, if I am a, multimillionaire in a mansion, it doesn't matter in the greater grand scheme of true eternity. And so with that always in the back of your mind, I know from personal experience, and not to say like, it's so hard. I'm really not trying to be a jerk. I'm not saying there's no good Christians that are good for the sake of being good, that are actually generous, but it's robbed you of the chance, I think, just by the nature of the belief to actually have this altruism. Because even Jesus, as he's giving these commands, he's saying, do this so that. Most of the time, Jesus says one of his thousands be's or should. It is followed up with so that you inherit the kingdom, so that you're not thrown into eternal flame, so that you're not cast into darkness. It is a reward system. It is a carrot and stick attached to the morality, both Old Testament and New Testament. Old Testament is much more obvious, but I think when people look at the so that's that Jesus gives, you can see that it is one big carrot or stick. And I don't think that non-believers, by the way, have escaped that. We have an evolutionary carrot and stick. We should be generous because we might be the one that needs someone to be generous to us sometime, right? There is this idea that the morality that has evolved was selfish. It was protective. And I think that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with a win-win situation. But and that's what I feel many believers do, that they're not operating out of that win-win situation, that longer-term plan, I think can rob the so-called morality that they have of its actual power of good. Curious your thoughts on that.
First of all, I think it's very interesting that you focused on the carrot when in my head, I always focused on the stick.
I had plenty of stick. I was terrified of hell and demons for about 2 decades. But
okay, yeah. I mean, and not to speak about your experience, I'm just talking about in this example.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also thought similarly that a lot of what we do in this life is supposed to be based on, or it's supposed to influence what happens in the afterlife. And I didn't focus so much on heaven. I mean, I wanted heaven. I wanted that freedom to be able to get and do whatever I want. But my biggest concern was hell. Heaven was basically not hell. And that was the best thing about it, before everything else. What you mentioned about people doing things for selfish reasons still. Yeah, I've thought about that as well. Like if I were to help someone, maybe in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, hopefully if I'm ever in that situation, I'm fostering a positive environment where people would help me if I needed help. And like you said, there's nothing wrong with that because it's not really a selfish reason in a nefarious way. You're not taking something from them. You're not hurting them in the process. You're increasing the good that's going around. So there's nothing wrong about that. I also don't want to paint myself or people like in our position as saints who do good for the sake of goodness because they're amazing. And no, I'm sure we're human and we still have flaws as well. And I wonder sometimes if I would do good things because they feel good for me to do good things. Like, is that selfish if I get dopamine from doing good things or if I feel a burst of happiness? Does that mean that my good deeds are no longer virtuous because I'm doing them selfishly? I don't know, but to this very day, I sometimes would do a small little good deed like removing trash, or something that's an obstacle from the road. And I don't want anyone to perceive me, or I don't care if anyone's perceiving me. In fact, it's kind of like proving to myself that I'm doing good for the sake of good, not for the sake of credit or reward or something of the sort.
Yeah.
And like you said, religion robs you of that chance that you're doing things without being recognized.
Yeah, because even if you divorced yourself somehow of the desire not to go to hell and the desire to go to heaven, you'd still be thinking, God sees me do this. God saw that good, generous thought I just had. Like, it infiltrates your world so much that you're not, part of the problem of religion is you're never alone. I really think that, as again, kind of going back to an evolutionary perspective, there are times where we're meant to recoup individually, even in a conscious space where we need this time for reflection or alone or anonymity to some degree, that is robbed of you the second you're in a religion that believes in thought crime, that is robbed of you the second you're in a religion that has an omnipotent being that can not only read your mind, but your motive and your intent. And I think that's something, like if I were a PhD, I think that's maybe one of the areas in religion that I would want to target is, what does this look like to be a being that is never alone, even though the other entity is invisible and intangible? but has realistic effects and outcomes in the real world based off what it notices about me in my private time. Again, I know I'm just throwing a lot of this back at you, but I'm so curious and happy to have a conversation with someone like-minded, but from a different background. What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about it a little bit earlier about how that was the source of, as you put it, my anxiety, my overthinking, because I always felt like God was watching me, that I couldn't even have privacy in my own thoughts. And we should be allowed to have bad thoughts as long as we don't act on them. And I'm not saying that in Islam, God is going to necessarily punish you for every bad thought that you had, but it was shameful knowing that he accessed that thought.
Oh, of course. The shame is unbelievable. And the dissonance is also unbelievable. You know, the example that's given the most is like a 15-year-old boy that's watching porn in secret, even though they're a believer. Like this boy who's a believer absolutely believes in a God that is omnipresent. So, like, you know, he wouldn't have opened the laptop if his dad was in the room, but he is doing it even though he believes his God is in the room. And so how do you square that? You know, many people have said an example like that shows that he probably doesn't really believe deep down in his core. And then other people have talked about the dissonance of just the removal of time or space or a physical presence, that even if you can conceptualize God is in the room with me right now, you can separate it to such a degree that you can do anything, you know, porn example or not. What do you think about that?
I think that's an excellent example because I thought of that myself. And as a believer, let's replace that with any generic sin. I know that God is watching me 24/7, even when I am sinning. But obviously, when I'm sinning, I'm not thinking about that specifically. Had God been like a parent in the room, then that would be hard to miss. You know, if my parent was attached to me all the time, like you said, maybe it's just that I can't visualize God in the room with me. So what ends up happening is you commit the sin despite your belief, and then your belief sort of pops in your mind. And like, hey, by the way, God was watching the entire time. And then the shame and guilt and it all just crashes down. And it's worse than, I don't know, I can't conceptualize doing it with God watching while I'm aware that God's watching, but I feel like it's worse that I forgot that God's watching and then I remember it again.
Yeah, you put him in a box when it's convenient for you to hide him away, and then the reality comes supposedly from your belief that he's never put away in that box. And yet we do it over and over. And again, yeah, any sin, stealing something, even gossiping. You know, how many people at a Bible study, or I don't know if do you guys have like Quran studies that are similar where you kind of get together at a house and everyone focuses on a verse and someone bakes
I
food?
think so, but it sounds like Bible study is a lot more social. So there's a lot more
Very
room for
social,
gossip.
turns in
Yeah.
typically to gossip sessions. You know, the prayer request is so that so-and-so can talk about how their sister cheated on their husband and needs prayer. But really, it was just an opportunity to like vent the gossip. That's not true for everyone in Christianity. But my point is, even at a Bible study where it's supposed to be about focusing on the word of God, if God were in the room, the person wouldn't have said it that way. But all those Christians believe he's in the room. They're praying to him. They're about to do the prayer request for this thing. Like this dissonance to me, I don't ever want to be the person that says, oh, they don't really believe, but there's so much dissonance that it is psychologically fascinating to me that people can, I do believe that they believe it to their very essence. I mean, they are going to be on a deathbed someday. They are going to think that when they breathe their last, the next moment they're going to see God in heaven and be accountable for their sins and all of these things. They really believe that. And yet we can act the way we do as believers, as anyone. I think that speaks to the disconnect with this invisible God, that we should be a little, that was a tip for me. At first I just called it dissonance. And then in my deconversion, I was like, maybe that shows how much this God isn't leaning in with his spirit pressing on my heart. Yeah, I feel guilty. I feel shame, but I don't actually feel like he's here. Otherwise, how could I have done this thing? And it was one of the first kind of eye-opening things for me. So you just made me think about it.
What is the purpose of this from God's perspective? Like, does God enjoy this dissonance, or does God certainly created us knowing that this dissonance will happen, but why would God create us, give us free will, watch us sin, watch us forget that he's watching us sin, and then watch us go through the guilt and shame once we realize that he's there? What pleasure does God get out of this? Or is this something that God's hands are tied?
And the second his hands become untied is when someone else's personal testimony is, I was about to do that drug again, and this time God showed up and he said no. It's like, well, do it for me, or why? Like, as soon as it's personal testimony almost works against the concept of God, because it does make him an anecdotal thing. And there's so many people we're willing to not believe. If I'm in church and someone is giving a personal testimony about Christianity, that's going to raise my faith, most likely. But if someone stood up in the congregation, they said, No, because listen, I'm a Muslim, and here's what Allah revealed to me last night in my quiet time. No one in that church, if it's a typical Christian church, is going to believe the Muslim. They're not going to believe that Allah revealed anything. So they know that individuals are capable of processing things through this spiritual lens and being wrong, and yet almost never apply that to their fellow Christians or even themselves, which again is just, I think, another larger form of the dissonance growing and expanding.
Well, I think religion offers a trap for that, a mental trap, because a Christian in that room would probably think that was the devil trying to tempt you. So there's an answer there. It's not a human mechanism, it's the devil, and it still keeps them within the bubble of Christianity and vice versa.
100% right. And I even know this to be true. I've talked about it so much. Sometimes you forget just how many excuses there are. But yeah, like this is the thing about apologetics, and I'm curious to hear what you think. Let me make my statement first. The thing about apologetics that's fascinating to me is, of course, they have seen every single issue. They've seen issues I still haven't yet identified, because I have never once in my life come upon a thought that's novel about why this religion is untrue or harmful. And then when I tried to figure out what people think about it, or how they excuse it, or what an apologist might say about it, or how the pastors preach against it, sure enough, someone has handled that. It's an obscure verse, but someone's got an answer for it. And of course they do. It's their job. And even if it's a really weak excuse, the very fact that there is something, someone else has thought about this and has an answer that kind of works in this religious philosophy, it's enough for most believers to say, there was an answer, even if it's not the answer. I'm curious to hear your take on the difference between Christian and Muslim apologist. And you tell me, have you listened to much Christian apologists?
A little bit here and there, but not as much as Muslim apologists.
Okay.
But I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but there are a lot more novel ideas to be found in Islam and criticized than in Christianity that haven't been answered by apologetics yet, because it's a recent phenomenon. Sometimes I animate or go through a story that one of the prophets have went through, and there are details that I'm sure there have existed Muslims that have asked questions about this, but there is no sermon, because it's a more recent phenomenon of putting Islam kind of under the microscope.
That is so wild to me. You're right, because I do know it was so much more insulated, and then because of the fear, of course, in the community, it happened so much later. I mean, the deconstruction of Christianity started around the Enlightenment period, and we've got a lot more time than it sounds like what has happened with Islam. So that I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's just truly fascinating to me that there's still so much people are finding, or at least addressing for the first time in kind of a more public on the books regard. But continue.
And I don't want to take credit for that, because to this very day, there are people, for example, members of my Discord server, who bring up a certain objection that I didn't think about before, and I've never seen a lecture about. And if there were to be a lecture about every single topic, I feel like Islam has a lot more questionable details than Christianity, but that's just my impression. I haven't studied Christianity. And because Islam is kind of slippery, because you have the Quran, which is the preserved book, but if you were to just read it, from cover to cover, you'd be lost at so many parts of the book, because there are stories that span multiple different chapters, and it's just a few verses here and there. And sometimes it jumps between stories. Sometimes you don't know what the hell the author is talking about. So you need the exegesis, you need the explanation. But where does the explanation come from? It's from Muslim scholars who have studied both the Quran and the Hadiths, which are the sayings about the Prophet, or things that the Prophet has said, that have degrees of authenticity according to certain measurements, but not as authentic as the Quran. And it's not the word of God. So you cannot take them as Bible, so to speak. There are a lot of details that Islam needs for the Quran to make sense that can only be supplied through very fishy and unknown and sometimes somewhat authentic sayings about the Prophet. And the discrepancies in those sayings are huge, but that doesn't seem to be an issue in Islamic apologetics, because they keep focusing on how the Quran doesn't have discrepancies. And it does, obviously, but there are ways to explain them away. Yeah. So it's such a slippery concept. If you were to spend enough time to scrutinize every detail of every story from the Hadiths, I don't have a lifetime for that. There's not enough time. It is fun sometimes, but even the Quran itself, there are certain details here and there that there haven't been lectures about yet. And to get back to your point, it is kind of scary or discouraging that when a believer is to come across such an objection or such a flaw and start to look it up or start to ask about it, there's already a prepared way to sort of steer them back in.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's bad to have good answers. That's not what I'm saying at all. They don't have good answers prepared. They have good ways of of deflecting prepared.
I think that's true for both religions in general. I would say the vast majority of apologetics is to get someone to not focus on the issue or to reframe it in a way that is more easily answered as opposed to an actual explanation, because most of what's left doesn't have a good explanation. That's why they need apologetics. Every once in a while, there will be like a newer atheist or someone that was never deep in the religion that's like, look at this contradiction I found. And it's like, no, that's not a contradiction. There is context here that matters. And there is an apologist answer that genuinely solves this problem. This is not real. But I think those are few and far between what people try to bring up, whether it's, issues in Jesus's genealogy between Mary and Joseph. Like, that's so simple, that has such a obvious problem that you cannot get away from in the contradictions within the Gospels. And yet, of course, there's still an apologetic answer, and it sounds smart and uses some big words, and it talks about the context of the time and understanding the male role, but why we don't also want to see it from Mary's world. And if you're a believer and you thought you had an issue, it's immediately crushed. Because unless you're going to go spend a year investigating this and understanding Jewish history and understanding male paternal rights and all of this, you're not going to be able to say, Mr. Apologist, you're wrong. And that is the game. And so I was just curious how much of the game for Muslim apologetics is skirting the answer versus thinking they have a legitimate, not biblical, but by the Quran anecdote for it.
I mean, there's both, and there's still that aspect of, especially the most asked questions, the frequently asked questions. They do have these lectures prepared for them, but there's a huge amount of deflection. And again, I don't know enough about Christianity to say if it's more or less, but you cannot have a conversation with an apologist without running into these deflections. It's almost impossible. To give you an example, they often ask you to question yourself before you question God's judgment. And that's similar to what I was doing earlier. I was saying that I overthink because I question myself all the time. They encourage you to trust God's judgment more than you trust yourself. And they say that if something seems contradictory to you, it's only because your mind cannot comprehend it, and so on. And my biggest objection to that is that could all be true. It could be the case that there are a lot of things in Islam or Christianity that seem contradictory or seem suspicious or don't make sense to me, but actually they do make sense and I can't comprehend the answer. But why create it that way? Are you not able to weave together a story, you meaning God? Is God not able to weave together a story that is not suspicious and has no flaws and cannot be argued about its flaws? Of course God can. So why does he resort to the use of apologetics? I don't understand.
It continues to point to the man-made nature of it, which is like a common theme on my channel is, yes, you're right. I love exactly how you said it. Sure, that could be true. That could be the case, but it's not what we would expect of a perfect God. And knowing that a perfect God could do better and chose not to is an issue in and of itself, even if it does not disprove this God. And I'm very similar in that line of thinking. What are the big ones in Islam, the big frequently asked questions, if you will, from doubters or skeptics?
So the one that I mentioned earlier of predestination and free will, that is a big one, I think. I wasn't exposed to it when I had that question. It was one that I had myself, and I do see it around every now and then. Now there are a lot more questions that object to the seemingly harmful morality of Islam when it comes to things like women's rights or violence against women or violence in general and wars and slavery. And there are answers to all of these things, but these answers don't really satisfy me. And if they did, I would be a Muslim. The one thing that really reassured me when I was deconstructing is the repetitive claim that Islam is perfect and the Quran is perfect. So to find just one flaw would be to deconstruct the entire thing or topple the whole house of cards. Yeah. And there are plenty of flaws, as I've demonstrated once before. There's a verse, for example, that instructs men to beat their wives if they fear their wives' disobedience, to quote the verse. And what that means exactly, it's not clear. Does that mean that she's disobeying you by sleeping with another man or by staying out too late? Or in Islam, a man has the right to tell his wife not to even visit her own family members at reasonable hours. So if she disobeys you there, do you have the license to beat her? That's all up for debate. And there's a whole new apologetics line of saying, well, you guys don't understand Arabic. The word could mean beat.
I've heard this recently. It's more like a pat on the butt, right?
Don't even get me started. Okay, so there's so many ways to take this. Some people say it doesn't mean beat at all. It means separate from, which is nonsense because in the same verse, it talks about separating before it says beating. Some say it's some kind of ceremonial, symbolic tapping, like you just tap her with a toothbrush or like tap her on her shoulder or whatever, which has its own problems because, that's infantilizing. And what does that achieve? Not really anything. And some focus on how in other parts, not of the Quran, but in the Hadith, there's an emphasis that you can't beat your wife on the face and you can't leave a mark. So they're saying it just means like a light little tap or something. But there are ways to abuse someone by beating them without leaving a mark and without hitting their face. And I could talk about this for a long, long time. But my point was, say I'm an apologist who wants to make the case that God didn't mean to say beat, he meant to say separate from. What kind of idiot would use the same word that means beat and separate? Why not use another word completely? And I was able to fix the verse with substituting one or two words. And that is fixing perfection, which is impossible.
So good. I love that. I'm curious if in Islam there's kind of this step down from a fundamentalist belief of inerrancy into a progressive belief of man-made or inspired. My guess is that there's not quite to the same degree. There's kind of a Christian license that, I grew up believing the Bible was inerrant. So like you said, one issue and it's done, right? And I found so many issues that before I was willing to leave the faith, what I had to do was reconstruct my faith as, oh, wow, I was in a branch of Christianity that was incorrect. I was in a denomination that was too literal. And I moved to a more progressive form of Christianity where the thinking was, these things happened and some of them are supposed to be historical narratives, and people like the gospel authors, who at that time I still thought were eyewitnesses, they're just writing things down from their own perspective. And of course, that's going to create maybe contradictory ideas, just like two witnesses at a car crash, all the apologetic answers. And you all of a sudden change your entire belief to still hold on to the same God. And even the same book is useful, just not perfectly truthful. Is there a step down, a ladder in Islam when it comes to the inerrancy of the Quran?
There is, but it's not as stable of a position to take because the Quran is the word of God and it is unchanged and it's unchangeable. And if you were to believe the Islamic narrative, God created the Quran before creating the universe, which is kind of wild that he wrote everything that would happen progressively in it, including the little disputes that the Prophet had before they even happened. So people can't say that there's an error in the Quran or in transcribing it or anything. They will say that this is a misunderstanding or mistranslation, often, especially people who don't speak Arabic as a first language, but even those who do, because the Arabic of the Quran is not the same exact Arabic that we use today. No one talks this way anymore. And it's not even that close to the standard Arabic. I mean, it's similar, but there are words that are from different languages that people don't even understand what they mean, but they figure out through context clues. There's the style of writing. Everything about it is not really the Arabic that we use today. So there's that scapegoat of, we're probably not understanding it right, or you're not understanding it right. And it bothers me so much when that arrogance comes from someone who doesn't speak Arabic natively or doesn't know the language at all. And they cling on to that assertion that it's just that the translation is incorrect. And I fall back to the same point that let's assume for a second that even an Arab cannot understand it properly. Why did God not making it any less confusing? Yeah, so those positions do exist. They're just not as stable, but they're out there.
It's very interesting because the same excuses are made with Christianity, but I'm realizing the difference is that all modern day Christians, for the most part, do not speak Aramaic, Greek, or Hebrew, the three languages of the Bible. So we're all at the same disbenefit. But every once in a while, when you can't account for something, they'll just go back to, you need to understand the original Hebrew. And then, of course, there's an apologist who got his PhD in Hebrew or whatever, and he's the one that really understands what is meant. And it's a frustrating thing to argue against, but I feel like there's at least an even playing field for Christians versus counter-apologetic Christians because none of us know Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic. But the reason I feel, and because I've been asked many times, Brandon, why don't you speak out against other religions or, Islam specifically? Like, why aren't you saying anything there? What are you scared? And more so than anything, it's because I don't think as a white person, a foreign infidel, I'm able to get past that first easy objection of, you don't know Arabic, therefore you can't understand the Quran correctly.
Most Muslims around the world do not speak Arabic. That is, I guess that's not something that most people think about, but
no, I guess that's
I can't
fair.
remember.
I hadn't really thought about it either, but thinking about where all Muslims are from, I mean, yeah, there isn't a consistent language there.
Yeah, it was baffling to me when I learned that I thought that Arabs were so many, like numerous, Arab Muslims were numerous compared to Muslims from other parts of the world. But no, there are a lot of countries in Asia, for example, that are full of Muslims. So there are more Muslims who don't speak Arabic than there are who do speak Arabic. That being said, though, the thing about the Quran is it's not translated and recited in other languages. So there are translations for people to read, but it's not like the Bible where you can recite it that way. You have to pray in Arabic. You have to read it in Arabic if you're properly reading it. So that emphasis has made it seem as if a lot of people know Arabic, but most people who are Muslim don't speak Arabic.
No, I appreciate a very kind and gentle correction of my ignorance from the West.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It is this weird gatekeeping, I think, that this original language matters so much. Again, to your point, you always have to bring it back to the hand tie of God then, to why he couldn't, or first of all, why he was the one that created languages. If you believe the Tower of Babel, it's like, oh, you put this into effect where we were all going to be confused and where we would need translation.
You and I and a bunch of other people are capable of translating a book to multiple different languages using technology and then reviewing the whole text. So God was capable of revealing the Quran in 5 languages, for example, or every single language that existed at the time, and also having it be eloquent and consistent. Now, that wouldn't be exactly a miracle, but it would be amazing that, one book is available in all these different versions around the same time. But instead, the version that we're sold right now is that the Quran is miraculous because it's so eloquent and beautiful in one language. And I don't think that's impressive enough. And even if it was, that's kind of a non sequitur, But if you were to have multiple books in different parts of the world that all agree with each other and they all translate perfectly, that would still be a non sequitur to the assertion that they're from God, but it would be a bit more convincing. Yeah.
The thing for me that I always thought that would have really convinced me, and I think even Non-Stamp Collector made a cartoon about it, is if when the Western world first showed up to the Native Americans just came out and were like, oh yeah, we know about Jesus. Of course we do. He died for our sins. This is revealed truth. Obviously, look, we have a book. Oh, that's our Bible. That could have happened and actually should have happened if this one God is the one God who actually wanted to reveal himself to all people groups, not just one chosen people group in one area, and allow it to spread. And it shows the man-made nature of the evolution of that religion spreading out from one area.
Islam has an answer for that too.
Yeah.
Like a trap that keeps you within the bubble is that God did reveal many, many messengers over the years, but all the religions got corrupted and turned into polytheism and so on. It's people's fault. They corrupted it.
Right.
But again, that's a non-answer, as you know. But yeah, I'm supposed to believe that even the Native Americans had a prophet back in the day, and then they lost their way. And that's why the religion doesn't look anything like.
So that is your answer for general revelation. It's not so much that God is doing it through nature. It's that there is a literal belief in Islam that every people group has had an opportunity to be exposed to this truth. Is that correct?
Not that every single group, but a lot of groups allegedly have, not naming any specific groups.
Yeah.
But there's one narration, for example, that says there were 124,000 prophets sent on earth, but we don't know all their names. The big ones are like a dozen or so. I can't remember exactly how many, less than a couple of dozen. But there was this, I can't remember if it's a verse or a hadith, but it says, I think it's a verse, we would not punish a people unless we had sent them a messenger, meaning that some people might not have received one at all. But the general implication is that God has sent many messengers over the years, and I would assume that they would be more spread out than just the Middle East, but who knows?
That's interesting. I know we only have about 10 minutes left, so I kind of want to move on from that and get close to wrapping up. Maybe one thing I wanted to end on, I'd love to hear your thoughts on whichever one of these you want to answer as kind of a final question, but I wanted to know a few things from you. One, what is the biggest conception about Islam to the Christian that you know, or even to the atheist that maybe you would like to help correct? And or B, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on, Islamophobia, just the idea that disagreeing with the tenets of Islam is somehow some bigotry, or how that's being played out in the West, especially as Islam comes on. Not to make you a speaker for these things, but while I have you, I'd be really curious, whichever one of those you want to tackle in whatever fashion to kind of close out here.
Well, I'll take the second one, actually, because it's something that I struggle with myself. Sometimes I'm labeled Islamophobic, and I don't know if I necessarily disagree with that, but I disagree with the implications of it. Because Islamophobia, I suppose, is an irrational fear of Islam. I don't have a fear of Islam, so I guess it doesn't really apply to me. And the dislike of Islam that I have is rational, as far as I can tell. Like, it's not really just out of the blue. I have reasons why I don't like certain things about Islam. But I don't also just go around saying we have to eradicate this religion and its followers and this is incompatible with life. I just point out the parts that need improvement or need calling out. And that's as far as I want to go. And I have no problem in satirizing some aspects of the religion, or like, non-stamp collector. Was that his name?
Yeah, it's either that or Dark Matter 2525. One of those two did that video, but they both do the satirical cartoons.
I've had a few videos that are similar to that nature. And the point of those videos, even though depiction of prophets is extremely frowned upon or haram in Islam, it's not allowed. I want to break that barrier without the point being mockery. It's a method to talk about the story, to visualize the story, because I can tell people my ideas. I would say, wouldn't it be funny if we visualized Allah as a call center agent? Yeah. But it doesn't drive the point home as much as actually showing you. And I'm not misconstruing the supposed facts that the religion relays. I actually show people this is what the book says, but this is how I envision it going. Or it's similar to this scenario that's more modernized, I suppose. But this would be considered Islamophobic to a Muslim because it is hateful to draw the prophet when the intention is not hate at all. It is disrespectful. Maybe they could say it is that disrespectful. But I don't believe in respecting symbols or characters that don't exist. I believe in respecting people's feelings, but I also believe that there are certain boundaries that need to be broken, and I'm trying to break them in tasteful ways. So to get back to the question about Islamophobia, I think it is there's a well-meaning notion behind it that you don't want to be hateful to people that you don't know, or cultures that seem foreign to you just by virtue of them being foreign, or just because there's negative stereotypes about them going on. But that's used to shield a lot of valid criticism that is targeted at the religion or even at followers of the religion when they do certain things. Like, there are places where, unfortunately, there's a lot of domestic abuse in Islam that is considered okay. It's not even considered domestic abuse, that other people don't want to touch or come near because that's just their culture. That's just their religion, and I don't like that kind of thinking. I think it's okay to criticize these things, but it's also not okay to paint all people by the same brush and generalize. So it's a very thin line to walk, and it's difficult to be called Islamophobic by both sides. Yeah. But I hope that people stop using that word all the time because it loses its meaning. Yeah. I think what they're looking for maybe is xenophobia, like fear of the other, fear of the unknown. But it is okay to not like, or it is okay to be afraid of Islam, and that doesn't make you a hateful person.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that. I know it's a sensitive topic, and it's something that Christianity has not really had to deal with. We are very capable, and this is one of the things that I will give credit to the US at this point. Still, it could be changing very soon, that we are able to so openly criticize Christianity without the same level of fear or even being called bigoted. I've never been told I'm bigoted against Christians. It is starting to happen more for Jewish bigotry, that if you criticize anything within Judaism, that's starting to happen more, maybe on the same level as being labeled Islamophobic. But Christianity somehow is fair game, which is something they love to talk about also. Anyways, I don't want to go over time with you. I have so much more I want to talk to you about, though, so I am going to have you back on again, or maybe we can do it on your channel. But I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. I really appreciate your candor and your philosophy in how you're approaching this and the goal that you have. I think it's very noble. So thank you very much for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me. And I know that we could talk for another couple of hours at least just in this one conversation. So I'm looking forward to the next time because I'm sure that's going to happen very soon.
Perfect. That sounds great, man. Yeah. Well, have a wonderful day. Thank you. I will send everyone over to your channel. Please make sure that you check out and subscribe to and follow Apostate Aladdin here. And we thank you for your time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Kit Boga, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rocket, and Sean; my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jared, and Christy; my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Maggie, Paul, Sparky, and Todd; as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people.